happens all the time.
So does that hurt the chances?
It's awful. I mean, and I hear because we have a lot of clients that are investors that are either private equity firms or venture capitalists or investors. And they'll tell you all the time, I see hundreds of these things. And I'd say the vast majority of them just are awful presenters.
Wow. Welcome to the first episode of the Brand Iron Podcast. We've got a very valuable show for you today with our CEO, Michael Doyle, who's built one of Denver's top-rated branding agencies, helping companies optimize their funding, marketing, sales, and technology needs. In this episode, we'll be covering the fundamentals of creating a persuasive pitch deck. And there's no one better to have this conversation with than Michael, who's created over 200 pitch decks and has helped companies raise over $5 billion in capital. So with that being said, let's get right into it. Michael, thank you for joining.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. So I took some time to think about how we could really provide our audience with as much value as possible. And I came to the conclusion that the best way for us to accomplish that is for me to take the position of someone who, knows completely nothing about pitch decks, right? So I want to create a hypothetical situation where, let's say I'm a business owner. I've built a pretty successful business, but I want to scale, right? And I don't have the cash flow that I need to be able to scale in the way that I want to. So I'm looking into different options on how to raise funding. Now, by nature, one of my personality traits is questioning everything, right? So my first question would probably have to be, what is a pitch deck and why do I need one?
Pitch deck is it's a common tool that companies use these days to convey their message or their brand story as well as their financial story. And depending on, and people use it for lots of different purposes, right? So one of the main purposes people do this is when they're putting together a concept or what their business wants to look like. And there's a lot of companies who use today that uses a pitch deck to be able to formulate their business concept or their idea. And a lot of times it actually replaces their business plan because it's not as detailed, but it's high level, but it kind of goes over the different core components of what the business, what its model is, who they're trying to appeal to, who are those personas or the targets they're trying to reach, what are the value points and the value proposition are going to speak to those specific targets. And then, what are the core components of that, whether it be a service offering, whether it be a technology or an app or a service or a product that kind of effectively communicate all the different core components of what that company does or what the brand does. And then they kind of spell out all of that as well as how they're going to at least kind of out really how you're going to take it to market, what that wants to look like, or talk about distribution. You're going to talk about different channels and different marketing. You're going to talk about sales and how you're going to fulfill that or close that sale, whether it be like an e-commerce platform, or you're going to have sales reps or sales teams. There's all these different things where you kind of lay out the different core components of what your business concept wants to be. And so that's the different components for like a pitch deck. And you use that to a lot of times formulate your own thought and or pitch it to partners, pitch it to potential employees, pitch it to potential people you want to partner with. And you kind of help formulate that, your model. Right. And then once you kind of solidify that, you can put it into the form of like a capital raise deck where you take pretty much the core components of what you've already got. But then what you do is you add in the financial performance, what your sales forecasts are going to be, or your revenue forecasts, your EBITDA forecasts, what your cash flow forecasts are going to be for your products, your services, your e-commerce or app or whatever it is going to be. You're going to spell out what do those financial projections look like over like a 12 months, 24, 36, up to 5 years. And you spell out these different financial scenarios and what they could look like. And so you really want to know. So you talk about and you spell out, and we like to do 3 different scenarios, a super conservative one. What does that look like? And kind of, are you getting over the hump? But also a moderate one. And we try to say, well, okay, if we're really kind of mapping this out, we kind of really want to make sure that we're going to do the conservative one that should be the minimum we're going to do. The moderate, if we're doing a little bit better, and the aggressive could be quite a bit better. But what we see, most companies come in with these aggressive financial models, and every investor knows that it's not reality.
Yeah.
And so we try to be way more practical about what's achievable and what's not achievable, so that people don't think we're totally unrealistic.
So yeah, that brings up a great point, right? Because as a business owner, obviously, we tend to do things on our own or try to figure things out ourselves first. And you did mention a lot of things, right? There's a lot of components that you need to get right to be able to craft a persuasive pitch deck. So what would you say is why would you say it's important to hire an expert as opposed to doing it myself, right?
Well, the first thing is, I would say the majority of people don't know how to tell a really good story. And because they're too close to it, they live it, they breathe it, they're in it, right?
Yeah.
And so when you work with a third party like ourselves, or we have the ability to take a look back, take a step back, kind of see the whole picture, and understand not only what the different components are. And here's what we see most of the time: when we get a deck, or we get kind of the ideas that they're putting together, there's all these facts, and there's all these different core components. It's like who we are, what we do, who we're trying to appeal to, but it doesn't tell a story.
Yeah.
And I'd say almost all of the decks we see, there's no storyline. There's no, here's kind of like here's the core components of a story. Here's who's here we're speaking to. Here's, the problem, or, the challenge, or here's the opportunity. And then how do we position our, a company or product or service to be able to effectively solve that problem, or create an opportunity. And so how do we help package that story and put together pillars of that story that combine together to create a really powerful, holistic message that sucks in potential investors or potential partners. And they go, oh, I see the story, I see the opportunity, I see the challenge. And they go, oh, and they start to get really excited about it. And so getting a third-party partner that has the ability to take a step back and see the bigger picture and be able to package the different components into a fluid story that's compelling, it's engaging, compelling, and really pushes them to be able to take action is what's critical.
Yeah.
The other thing that most companies do is almost all don't tell a good financial story. And they'll either put a spreadsheet in there and say, here's what we're going to be able to do. But I mean, I've seen it. So you've got this like 1-point type and all these spreadsheets, but there's no story there. It's like, or I've seen it like 20 slides on their financials and what it could look like. And you just, every time you would present that, I would glaze over just looking at those things and say, how do we take all this data and distill it down into a nice, tight financial story, talking about your revenue, talking about your profit or EBITDA, talking about your cash flow, talking about either number of downloads or subscribers or doors you have, whether it be a store component or homes you have or buildings or whatever. What are the different parameters of what your financial story is going to be, and kind of break it into those bite-sized chunks that help tell that compelling financial story, not only about the model, but about the investment itself and what the investors are going to be able to get and see with the return on their investment and what that's going to look like over a period of time.
Yeah. So what I'm getting is that definitely the story is what makes a persuasive pitch deck, right? That's the difference between a pitch deck that'll, increase the likelihood of compelling investors versus just kind of getting tossed aside and really not getting any attention towards your pitch deck. So with that being said, what is kind of like a framework that you typically follow to be able to tell that effective story, right? I know for myself, in terms of, writing content or, maybe even writing a landing page, I always try to use the ADA method, which is a model that outlines, the story, right, of a certain landing page. I don't know, is there something similar with pitch decks, or, is there maybe like a set framework that you typically follow?
Yeah, there is, but they're all variations depending on, depending on the situation. or circumstances, right?
Yeah.
All of it, they start with, what either one of two ways. It typically goes down one or two ways. It could be start of what's the current problem or what's the current challenge, and how is this new product, this new service, or this new app or new technology is going to solve that problem, right? And so we kind of go down that framework. Or the other one is an opportunity slant. So we're not necessarily solving a problem, but it's more we're creating, whether it be through a new technology or a new process or a new system, it's creating a new opportunity and a whole new way of thinking about things and creating all these new opportunities. Like, here's a really good example. AI. Well, AI isn't, yes, it's solving a problem, but more importantly, it's creating all these new opportunities because it's a totally different way of doing things, and you're, aggregating all this data, and you're going to be able to see more and do way more, way faster. So if I was to do something in AI, it'd probably be opportunistic versus a challenge or solving a problem.
Wow.
And then once you do that, you say, okay, well, if it's that problem or if it's that opportunity, who are we trying to target? Twofold, not only on who we're going to sell this product or service to, or, that's one. And what's that look like? We also got to think of mine too, is who is going to be the right type of investor that this needs to appeal to too. And what does that look like as well too? And, you've got to be able to have the vision to be able to take a look at and say, who we're selling this product or service to, but also what's our profile of an investor or a strategic partner or a financial partner that this would make sense to. And so how do you kind of tell those parallel stories in something that makes sense? And you take this potential partner or this potential investor down this story journey that's going to be able to solve or answer all their anticipated questions, and be able to say, here's all the different core components, and getting towards a storyline that walks them through the entire scenario, as well as what the ultimate opportunity is, whether you're solving a problem or creating an opportunity, what that opportunity looks like, and why this makes sense, and why it's compelling, and really looks really, really interesting from an investment standpoint.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point, honestly. And you did mention something that I think is like really big at the moment, which is AI, right? So I do want to ask you a question for those that might be thinking of, writing up a pitch deck for the AI industry. So how would you approach outlining the opportunity, right? Just because it's something that's so big, so new, changing so fast. What would be kind of some tips that you would have for someone that's, writing a AI pitch deck specifically?
Well, that is what we call, like, when you're talking about like a technology like an AI, that's what we call like a green field opportunity, because there's a whole new outside the realm of what's commonly done today. And that's a little bit challenging. And so you've got to be able to say or kind of have this bigger picture vision of, what is, who is this going to be targeting, and how could we package this? And here's the challenge. Anytime you have an opportunity like an AI, we call it, there's so many people call what they call boiling the ocean, where the opportunity is so big and you can't do all of it. So you have to pick a niche. You have to package it, or solve a particular problem, or do a particular thing that people could put their arms around and buy into. Because you can't be all things to all people, and it's the all thing. It does everything.
Yeah.
And you've got to be able to say, we're going to do X, and we're going to be experts at X, and this is what we're going to be and do, and this is how someone can put their arms around it and buy into it and understand why this makes sense. And that's the hardest part about, especially with like a new technology, AI, is there's so many opportunities, but you can't sell everything. So you got to take it into one specific application, and how you're going to be able to package that and sell that and put it into a compelling message that people can, understand, and then say, yep, that makes complete sense. understand it, and that's totally worth that investment. So, yep, let's do that.
That's great insight. So, in terms of outlining, I definitely agree 100%.
And one more thing on that. So, and what we see when we're talking about like a greenfield opportunity like AI, the other challenge is how do you make accurate forecasts as far as like financial projections are concerned, right?
Exactly.
And so what I like to see is, okay, well, if we're going to go after this one sector of the market, how big is that market? How many people or how many companies or how many, what the geography looks like? Or so you have to kind of take a traditional framework and build off this and build. It's almost like if you ever did speech and you had to put together like an argument and put the frameworks or the pillars of your argument to be able to justify a conclusion.
Right.
Well, you've got to be able to do the same thing in a financial story where you're building off a traditional framework that allows you to get into this greenfield opportunity, but it's within a specific niche or a specific opportunity or towards a specific persona or market. And then you can say we're going to be able to go after this market, which has this many people or this many companies. We think we're going to have a conversion of 0.5%, and we're going to, convert so many these opportunities into customers, and an average cost per month or average ticket price of X. That's going to parlay into revenue of Y and cash flow or EBITDA of Z and X, and so you've got to be able to build that framework or that thought process of how you're putting together your financial projections and or pro forma that when these investors in their mind go, I get it. I see how you're coming up with this. That makes a logical sense. And I see how you've come to this and I can buy into that.
Yeah.
And a lot of times in AI, a lot of people do is there's the sky's the limit. Well, it never worked. I mean, this many opportunities, 1/2 of 1/4 of 1% actually work out that way. And so how do you put together an argument where you say, this is realistic and we think this has legs and you can make this happen? And that's the challenge that most companies don't know how to effectively, handle, as well as answer that question.
Yeah, definitely. No, that definitely makes sense. And then you did cover the financial story aspect of the deck. So apart from those, right, we introduced, let's say, for example, we introduced the opportunity or the problem. We introduced how we're going to seize the opportunity or solve the problem. We have our financial models, right? We have our financial story in place. What are some other things that you see that it's important to also include to be able to persuade the investors we're presenting to, right?
Yeah, another core component is we call it a marketing and sales process, because every investor or partner wants to know, well, how are you going to take it to market, and how are you going to market this thing, and two, how are you going to generate leads, how are you going to manage those leads and close these sales, and what does that look like? Is it marketing activities, internal sales team? Is it going to be just an online digital play? Are you going to have quote unquote boots on the ground like a Salesforce? There's all these different components that you've got to be able to address to say, because it's not good enough just to have the idea. You got to be able to talk about how we're going to take this idea, how we're going to package it from a branding perspective, but then how are you going to market this thing, and how are you going to drive sales and revenue, and what does that look like? You also got to talk about the operational backbone, and what does that look like? Are you building an app? Are you building a software? Are you building our manufacturing plant? And this is what the plant looks like. And we're going to use these machines to be able to do this. Or we're going to manufacture this product, but we're not going to do the manufacturing ourselves. We're going to hire a contract manufacturer that's going to be able to do this, implement this, and we're going to do this shipping solution or this warehousing, and we're going to use this for distribution. So not only is the sales and marketing component, you've got to be able to talk about what's your operational infrastructure like to be able to effectively pull this off.
Yeah.
Another core component too is they want to know who the team is. They want to know who the team is on your team, who the CEO is, who the CFO is going to be, who's going to run sales or marketing, who's going to run operations or distribution or manufacturing. And you've got to have a good team that the investors know, well, we're going to make this, $10 million investment. You've got the team to be able to pull this thing off successfully.
Right. Yeah, no, and you did cover a great point that I did want to go into, which is there's a lot, right? For example, with AI, right? Let's say my business is very complex. There's a lot that I want to include in this deck, but as being a copywriter, I understand the power of keeping things concise and increasing readability, right? So what can you speak on that, right? Is it important to keep things concise, and how do you balance that between, including all the information you want to include, but also making sure that it's still readable and concise, right?
Yeah. Here's how I like to think about that is, most time when you set up a meeting, you've got about an hour. And so how do you convey a really compelling message within an hour? A lot of times, but it is a lot of times, we get these 100-page decks that it's information overwhelm. And how do you take all that information and all of this opportunity and boil it down into I call the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, where you just say this is who we're this is what we do, here's who we're targeting, here's how we're going to package that, here's how we're going to take it to market, here's how we're going to be able to support it, here's the team that's going to run it, here's the financial story, what we're going to be able to produce. And if we got an hour, how do you tell that story within basically half an hour, 40 minutes? So that in an hour, you start and you've got a nice, clear, and concise message that's snappy and get, and start out of the gates that's really compelling and gets the partner or investor excited. So they start asking questions right out of the gate. So you take your 30 to 40 minutes worth of content, and all of a sudden, before you know it, because you've done a great job in the first 5 minutes, you suck them in because you got them engaged and excited. That 30, 40 minutes worth of content becomes an hour-long conversation. And that's really what this is all about. That's why it's telling a story. And if you talk about how you tell a story to kids, the best part about it, when they've got their eyes, they're all gloss over and they're like, this is awesome. Well, investors do the same type of thing. You'll be able to tell a story where you get them excited. They start to think about all the opportunities. They have all these questions for you. And how do you package and tell your story within that 30, 40-minute window? And you've got, let's say 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A or conversation about what this opportunity is and who's the teams that are going to be able to execute this and the returns you're going to be able to produce. And that's really what you need to do, is think about it in how do you put together that simple, clear, and concise message within 20 or the 30 to 40 minutes. And we like to think it's in like 25 or so slides. And if you've got let's say a minute a slide, there's 25 minutes, plus you've got some other questions. That's kind of really understanding, putting together like your story, your message, and understanding of how you're going to tell the story, what slides and what the pace of that wants to be, and practice that not only in the deck, but practice the conversation and how that's going to go down, anticipating what we call the FAQs, or the frequently asked questions that you're going to get asked, or what do those look like?
Yeah.
And say those, go ahead.
Yeah. So that actually, it adds to what you mentioned earlier, right? Which how important it is to have somebody, a third party, look at your business from a outsider's perspective. That way, they'll be able to effectively keep things concise and make sure that you're communicating what's important, right? Because if I'm in the business day by day, I know a lot of things that I want to include in there, right? So it's going to be a lot tougher for me to remove things and try to keep things concise. So that's definitely a big reason why it's important to have a third party, take a look at your deck. So you did go into something else that I did want to cover, which is the actual presentation itself, right? So let's say we have the deck already. We've hired you, Michael, for the deck. We created a concise deck with a good story, good brand, and financial story. Now, what are some tips and kind of best practices that you would kind of recommend for me to go into the meeting and really pitch this effectively?
Yeah, I like to say is that when you're working on this, yes, you've got it in the form of slides, but you've got the story format. You've got the pillars of the story. You've got the main points you're trying to get across. And you really can think about that in your head, and you've already got it kind of mapped out in your head of what the story is, what the core components are, or the key messages of that story are. And what you're really trying to do is engage in a conversation. And it's got to be a conversational, and you're using your slides to help not read off this. I've seen, oh my God, it's awful when people read off the slides. It's just horrible. But you're using it to really, what you're trying to do is have, whether it be a visual story or bullet points or visuals or infographics on here to help you say, oh yeah, this is the main story on this slide. These are the 3, 4, 5, 6 main points we want to communicate on this particular slide. And I like to think about it in a story fashion, where you've got an overall, here's the story, here's the key message or the themes or the chapters of that story. And then you put slides that support those chapters and those themes within there, and you know the different core components that you've got to be able to effectively communicate to tell that story. And so I like to think about it as, if you can know it in your head, and if you can know what the main story is and the different chapters and the key messages, and I like to have it memorized. That's just me. Not all people like to do that or can do it, or as in conversational. But if you can have it pretty well memorized and know the story by your heart, and you live it and you breathe it, the investors look at you as like, man, they're bought in. They love this thing. They get it. They understand it. They're passionate about it. They're passionate about the idea, the team, and they're passionate about being the ones to be able to successfully pull this thing off. And knowing it and living it and breathing it is really, and really being able to sell it is a key component. Yeah. So part of it is you just got to know it really, really well, and have that framework kind of spelled out in the back of your mind. And so when you pull up the presentations to the slide, it's just a visual reference of what that story is for that slide, and where that lies on that journey that we're trying to communicate during that story.
So let me ask you this. I've heard this a lot around all over the internet, right? Which is, investors invest in the entrepreneur, not necessarily on the business itself, right? So that kind of brought that up. Like the importance of being able to pitch that effectively, right? And using the deck as a reference point, not necessarily as it doing the selling. So how true is that? Do investors really bet on the entrepreneur more than the business? Or, what are some insights that you might have in that?
Oh, yeah, they do, but you got to have a solid plan, and you got to have a solid offering or a solid model that makes sense. And they got to believe in the people that's going to do it. That's why I say it's a conversation, right? You've got to be able to sell yourself. You got to be able to sell the team. It's not about yourself either. They don't want most of them. It's because, like, for me, it's not about me. It's about the whole. There's all these different team members, so it's not. Yeah, I'm just a figurehead, but at the end of the day, we've got all these different valuable team members that allow us to do this thing, and that's what they want to see. They want to hear. Yeah, they got someone who can speak it and lead the conversation, but they want to know that you've got a team behind you, and they want to know that they've got all these different things in place to be able to effectively pull this off. And right. So how do you communicate that story and convey that story? And what does that look like? So
how likely is someone to be rejected for investment if they have a great pitch deck, but their presentation, the way they presented it, might not have been the best, right? They might have been reading from the deck itself, or, maybe...
It happens all the time.
So does that hurt the chances?
It's awful. I mean, and I hear it because we have a lot of clients that are investors that are either private equity firms or venture capitalists or investors. And they'll tell you all the time, I see hundreds of these things, and I'd say the vast majority of them just are awful presenters.
Wow.
And their decks, they look at them and they, it's got to look good, but it's got to tell a great story. But then the people got to be able to really sell it. And yeah, investors make investments in the people, but you've got to have the right combination between a sharp looking deck that tells a great story, communicates why this is a great model. You've got to be able to sell it personally from an individual standpoint. You've got to be able to communicate that you've got a great team behind you. You've got to be able to communicate this is a great financial opportunity. And you've got to be able to bring all these components, and it's all this vast array of content into that 30 to 40 minute content and tell it into a 1 hour conversation and compel them. And yes, you've got to be able to have all those, you've got to have a solid story throughout, and it's got to be able to make sense, and it's got to be able to engage them, get them excited. And yes, they may buy or invest in a person, but it's not the person. It's all these core components together that really gets them over the hump.
Definitely. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's say, for example, hypothetically, right? I'm a business owner. I know my strengths and weaknesses. I know that one of my strengths is not presenting. How would you recommend me to navigate that, right? Like, would I be able to, like, do investors typically want to see the founder, CEO, right? Like, or can I kind of just send someone on the team to do so whose strength is presenting? How would you recommend me to approach that?
Yeah. They do. It's not necessarily the CEO that has to present it. The CEO could be the ringleader, if you will. Like if you take a look at, or the coach, right? He doesn't necessarily have to do. In fact, it's better if the CEO doesn't do the whole talk. It's better if you've got a good team that speaks to the different components. In fact, if the CEO can talk about or make an introduction about who the company is and who we're trying to serve and what it is we do. But then you have some, like in the financial, let's say you've got a CFO that could speak about the financial story, or you've got someone in sales and marketing can talk about the marketing and sales process and what does that look like. You got a head of operations that could talk about all the different infrastructure that's going to be able to effectively support this to be able to do this. Let's say you've got a design engineer or someone like that, or someone who's like the chief strategist, or from a consulting perspective. If you've got all these different core components and the people that fill those seats, it's really less upon the CEO, and it's really upon they got a solid team, and they sound like they really have an idea of not only who the right people are, but what they're doing and how they put all these different core components to be able to deliver on this. That's a lot better presentation when you have all these core individuals that could be able to tie all these core components together to be able to put it together.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. But as you mentioned, right, just having the CEO themselves tell a good story and be confident in that story they're telling is very hard. And I'm assuming, having both the CEO and the team, tell a great story and be confident in that is a lot harder. So I could see why that would be very, very effective, right? So, okay, we've talked a bit about, how, some tips on how we could effectively present the pitch deck. But in the world of in this online world that we kind of all got sent to after COVID, right? I'm curious on how we could increase the likelihood of actually, showing up in front of investors, right? I'm assuming maybe everything's digital now. I'm not really sure, but how do we increase the likelihood of an investor picking up our deck and actually wanting to meet and talk about the opportunity?
Well, that's another key component, right? Is not the deck, but how are you going to get in front of investors, right? Do you have, depending on what stage you're at, whether you're a startup and you're trying to go after what we call like a friends and family, have you identified people that you need to get in front of that's going to be able to help you put together or write a check to be able to help you bring the thing out of the ground, if you will? Or if you're what we call a small, medium-sized business, do you have whether financial partners that you can reach out to, or do you have relationships within the banking community, or do you have relationships with a venture capital firm or private equity firm, or investment banking firm? And then if you're on the larger side, I'm sure you've got plenty of entrees into the different financial markets as well too, and relationships there. And so it's not just good enough to have a deck, but you've got to be able to know who are you taking this deck to, who are you going to go out and present it to, and what does that sales funnel look like to be able to build up, get in front of people and pitch this thing and get referrals of who might be interested in it, and really work it. And that's the deck's one core component. The other huge component is how are you going to take this deck to market? Who are you going to take this deck to? Who are you going to sit down in front of and present this to and garner interest as well as money? And that's just as important and probably harder for most people than the deck itself.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I mean, how would you recommend, hypothetically, right? I have no relationships, right? I don't know any wealthy people, investors, anyone. How would you recommend someone like that to really approach this and, get in front of investors at the end of the day?
There's a lots of different opportunities. You can do search these days for investors in technology companies or real estate investors or investors in, let's say a company that's in the water space, or a company that's like a financial product or a real estate opportunity. And so you can do a lot of research and say, who are there real estate investment firms, or, which capital partners or investment banking firms work in these specific markets, and what those start looking like. And there's no shortage for picking up the phone or sending out an email or sending out a LinkedIn message to all these people to start to build a relationship with them, and just doing your homework and saying, what's the landscape look like within my, who might be interested in my product or my service or my technology. And there's no substitute for just, rolling up your sleeves, getting dirty, making those calls, sending those emails out and knocking on doors until you start to open up some doors. And when you start to open up some doors, they go, I'm not interested in this, but you may talk to Joe down the street, or, I know this guy that works over here, or invest in these types of things. And you're never going to know about those until you start meeting and pitching and opening up and asking for referrals for people that may be interested in this.
Yeah, definitely. So would you recommend me to, start building those relationships before I'm looking for an investment? Or, obviously that would make the investment round easier, right? But, is that something that, is recommended?
You should be doing them in parallel. And so you've got to know, I'm working on, here's my model. Who's it going to appeal to, not only from selling that product or service or that investment, but then you got to think about, okay, well, who are those investors and what does that want to look like? And you probably got to work on the message and the deck in parallel to, okay, who am I going to meet with once I have this thing ready, and who should I go talk to?
Yeah. And it
all in parallel.
Yeah. And it all ties back with having a great story, right? Because that story you'll be able to leverage on those cold emails, cold calls, whatever you're using to reach out to investors. So it all ties back together to the brand story and financial story as well.
Yeah. Another piece that we'd like to do, in addition to the decks, we'd like to put together what we call like a teaser piece. It's not the full deck, but it's a teaser talking about the opportunity and who we are and who's it appealed to. And it's just like a front and back or a couple slides in a deck. Here it is, what problem we're solving or what the opportunity is. And this is what we're thinking. And we'd love the opportunity to meet with you and tell you the whole story. And so it's just the headline, if you will, with a tease on, one maybe critical component or one critical value point, and that's going to solve this problem or create this opportunity, gets them super excited so they want to meet with you and hear the whole presentation. That really helps a lot too. If you can send that out as a precursor, or send it out to and see if they have an interest to find out more, that helps a lot.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Definitely. Yeah. include that in cold emails, send it over to their email after a cold call. That definitely, I could see how that could build up interest, right? Is there any, I know you did cover some of the outline, but is there any best practices when creating one of those that you've seen maybe might convert higher than others, right? I know you've done a couple of these, so definitely have some insider insight on this.
Yeah, you know what? I always say that's the hardest piece. And so you do that in parallel, or you do the full deck first and say, okay, what are the core, instead of these 6 message or 6 storylines in the bigger picture deck, how do I condense it into the 1 or 2 ideas?
Yeah.
And what does that one look like? And the key for that is, how do you make it really simple? How do you make it more visual and bullet points or infographics and some text versus telling the whole story in 1 or 2 point type on, and it's just you're jamming as much content into that teaser piece. That doesn't work. You've got to figure out, how do you tell the story as a whole, and then how do you tell the Cliff Notes version of it on like a couple of slides or a front page and a back page, and so you can email it out or hand it out, or however you're going to get it out there to be able to get people excited to want to meet with you on that. That's the hardest part, really.
Yeah.
And if you understand the big picture first, it helps you tremendously to distill it down into, a 2 or 3 minute piece that someone can look at and say, yeah, I want to find out more.
Okay, so I have to ask this because I know there's some founders out there that are probably asking themselves this, but have you ever encountered a business model or a pitch deck where you weren't able to do that, where you weren't able to condense everything into 1, 2, 3 bullet points, right?
No, but the hard part is keeping it simple, and people have the tendency to really, really want to tell everything on that piece.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I have to be a lot of times I'm the voice of reason, or I'm trying to help them package that as much as possible. So it really is just a teaser and not the whole story. But I think almost every opportunity you can do that. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out what is the most compelling teaser and what are the different components, so it makes sense.
Yeah. Now, last question that I have, which is, how would you get feedback, right? Let's say, I created my pitch deck, I'm reaching out to investors. How would I know if the pitch that I created, it's effective in terms of, captivating investors and persuading them, right? Like, what are some feedback points that I could look at, to be able to tell if my pitch deck is performing or not?
What I like to do is I like to practice with your friends and family, or like a mentor or someone. Practice, and get their feedback and say, what'd you think? Or how did this section, or how did this story? But there's no substitute for practice and working through it and see if it resonates or not. And opening yourself up to constructive criticism and really working on your craft to be able to tell this story. And there's no substitute of actually telling it. Here's the other thing I tell people to do sometimes is videotape yourself, or do like a conversation where you're recording it and talking to a friend like this, and then watching yourself tell a story. And, there's no substitute for watching yourself tell a story. And you're like, oh, God.
Definitely, yeah.
So there's no substitute for practice. There's no substitute. It's just like anything else. You practice long enough, and you critique yourself, and it really helps you get a lot more comfortable and confident with the story that you're telling.
That's great. So in terms of feedback, we do have something really special for those that are still watching this video. If you take a look at the description on this video, you'll see an option to schedule a 20-minute pitch deck audit with Michael. It's completely free. And Michael, can you talk a bit about what someone might gain from that call?
Yeah, so what we'd like to do is, if people want us to take a look at the deck, send it over. I mean, we can sign an NDA, so it's confidential, but allow us to take a look at it, schedule a call. We can give you feedback or constructive criticism. of the different components, and does it really tell a story? Is it compelling or not? Does it tell a financial story or not? And give you some constructive criticism about the strengths, the weaknesses, as well as the opportunities and what those look like. There's the other component too, is not just taking the deck itself, but a lot of times I say, read a couple slides or kind of present a couple slides for me, so you even give them some feedback on the presentation in and of itself too. I think that's another critical component as well too.
Awesome.
So I think it makes a huge help of confirmation about what it is you're putting together and how we can be assistants to either help you put it together better or even potentially help you present it better.